waning days following the fall of Isengard, when Treebeard's Ents had all but ruined Saruman's stronghold, a shadow of opportunity stirred beneath the scorched earth. Though the White Wizard was toppled from his seat of power, caged in bitterness and regret, his mind had not wholly forsaken cunning. Word of his downfall reached the watchful ears of Sauron's servants, carried by Creebane that still lingered, returning to the Dark Tower with news of Isengard's ruin. Within the black dominion of Barad-dûr, orcs scurried about the forges, trolls groaned as they toiled, and the great eye surveyed the realm ceaselessly. Among those who served Sauron, there arose an idea. Could there yet be use in Saruman's host of Uruk-hai, scattered though they might be? At first, the captains of Mordor's orcs heaped scorn upon the notion. They spat at the ground, recalling the proud, disciplined ranks of the Uruk-hai, forged by the White Wizard's dark knowledge, who had marched without fear beneath the banner of the White Hand. These orcs remembered a time when Saruman claimed an independence of will that Sauron did not smile upon. They bristled at talk of an alliance with the spawn of that traitor. Yet even so, Sauron had no pride that would surpass his lust for domination. In some hidden recess of his mind, cold and calculating, a new plan began to take shape. While the Fellowship rode and men sought alliances in distant lands, the eye looked beyond the immediate battlegrounds. If Saruman's forces could still be bent to the Dark Lord's will, it would be an advantage that might shatter the resolve of Gondor long before the Rohirrim could lend them strength. The first messenger ventured forth from Minas Morgul under cover of night. He was a ring of shadow among the jagged rocks, ever watchful for patrols or wandering eyes. The orc was gaunt, with elongated limbs, the brand of Barad-dûr seared into his armor. Through many perilous paths he traveled, until at last he emerged near the fringes of Fangorn, where the remains of scattered Uruk-hai warbands still lurked. Disorganized and battered by defeat, these Uruks yet prowled, hungry for vengeance against the men of Rohan who had humiliated them at Helm's Deep. Among the black pines and tangled brush, the messenger found a small band, survivors bruised from the recent conflicts. They snarled and threatened him at first, suspicious that he might be a spy or a foe seeking to finish them off. But the messenger bore a dark token from Sauron's hand, a sigil recognized by the cunning among them as a mark of a far greater power. "We bring you an offer," the messenger hissed, his voice guttural. "The eye looks for more slaves, but also for those with strength to break the lands of men. Serve him, and you shall taste vengeance. Serve him, and the spoils of war shall be yours." The band listened warily. They had lost faith in the White Wizard, for Saruman had retreated into the Tower of Orthanc, stung by Entruin and the might of Rohan. They nursed their anger at having been betrayed and left to their own devices while Isengard fell. Yet the promise of vengeance was sweet, and Orcish cunning ever finds a way to bargain cruelty for cruelty. Thus was the first seed of alliance sown. In the coming weeks, hidden from the watchful men of Rohan who now kept guard around the battered fortress of Isengard, more of Saruman's scattered Uruks slipped away. They were drawn by the rumor that Mordor itself beckoned, promising iron, black blades, and above all, an unrelenting hatred of Gondor that might satisfy their bloodlust. In secret valleys, between the southern eaves of Fangorn and the savage slopes near the Misty Mountains, groups of Uruk-hai emerged, forging pacts with Sauron's messengers. Most orcs from Mordor despised them, jeering at them as upstart half-breeds. But the Uruk-hai returned the disdain with equal measure, and soon the squabbles devolved into many small and vicious fights. Such was the chaos of melding two warlike folk. Saruman's spawn, strong in body and discipline, bristling at any sign of disrespect, and Sauron's legion, old as darkness, resentful of interlopers. Yet above all these petty hatreds, the dread of Sauron's wrath loomed, and grudgingly, step by step, they learned to fight side by side rather than murder one another. Meanwhile, in Isengard, Saruman lingered in seclusion, perched high in Orthanc's pinnacle. Rumor had it that he was weaving new designs, even while a watchful Ent or two remained near the outer circles of the Vale. Deep in the tower, by candlelit gloom, Saruman brooded over the Palantir, searching for an advantage. His mind was like a snare, seeking to entrap any stray chance that might allow him to re-emerge in power. If indeed Sauron courted his Uruks, perhaps Saruman could twist that arrangement to his own ends. And so, in the secrecy of Orthanc, a hush fell upon Saruman's loyal servants still within the tower, men and half-orcs alike, who awaited new commands. The White Wizard's voice, once booming and persuasive, was now only a low hiss as he conferred with the vestiges of his retinue. "We have been humbled, but we are not broken," he muttered, gripping the rail of stone with knuckles white. "If my Uruks should join with Sauron's hordes, they may strike a blow from which the men of Gondor cannot recover. And then, we shall see what place is left for me in the new order." Days turned to weeks, and Sauron's network of spies and watchers spread out across the land to find each and every warband. Slowly, the Uruk-hai were drawn to the edges of Mordor, establishing hidden camps in the rough lands east of the Anduin, or near the secret passes that led south of Mirkwood. Supply caravans of black iron and crude provisions fed their ranks, forging a stronger, deadlier horde. Among them was a cunning Uruk-hai captain named Grashnak, a name reminiscent of an orc lieutenant known for cruelty, who had, in the past, served the White Hand with distinction. He had led hunts across Rohan's plains, and his name was cursed by many men who had survived encounters with him. Now, he found himself answering to a higher chain of command under the banners of Mordor. Though it galled him to bow to Sauron's lieutenants, he recognized the power that radiated from the east. He was introduced to the larger orc forces under General Gorbog, an ancient orc who had served Morgoth in the earliest days, so the rumors claimed. Gorbog stood tall for one of his kind, skin pitted by old scars. His eyes gleamed with cunning, and in them one sensed a cold understanding that any sign of disunity would be crushed by Sauron's unwavering discipline. This orc general held no love for Saruman's upstarts, but he had learned that the might of the Uruk-hai was formidable, and so an uneasy respect formed. Grashnak recognized Gorbog's experience, while Gorbog saw in Grashnak a potent battlefield leader, skilled in siege and cunning in ambush. Their alliance was tested during the early skirmishes that erupted along the Anduin's eastern banks. Gondor's outposts, small watchtowers and hidden garrisons, began noticing an increase in orc activity. The men stationed there were accustomed to raiding parties from Mordor, but these new adversaries were fiercer, better organized, more cunning. Rumors spread among the soldiers that Saruman's breed had joined with the orcs of the east. When riders carried this intelligence back to Minas Tirith, Denethor, still steward, full of burdens and sorrow, grew grim. He had lost trust in wizards long ago, and hearing that Saruman's spawn now lent their strength to Sauron fed his darkest fears. In the great white city, the mood was tense. Faramir and his rangers, still patrolling Ithilien, caught glimpses of these combined forces. They set traps along the forest paths, felling many an orc. But even in victory, they felt a chilling sense that a great host was massing in the darker corners beyond their reach. Some men spoke in hushed voices. "If the Uruk-hai can march beneath the eye, we may face an army like none before." Aragorn, newly come into the realm under his alias as the returned king, though still contending with doubt and duty, watched these developments closely. Gandalf, now Gandalf the White, roamed abroad, seeking any sign of a final move from the Black Land. His heart was heavy with the knowledge of Saruman's fall. If the White Wizard had found a way to preserve his ambitions through an alliance with Sauron, he might still play a role in the final catastrophe. The Grey Pilgrim's old friend and sometime rival had become something else entirely. A cunning enemy, hidden in Orthanc's shadow, nursing resentment. Yet for a time, it appeared that Saruman's power was too diminished for him to mount any direct move. The Ents and Rohirrim kept his tower under vigilant watch. So it was that even as the Uruk-hai gathered beyond Rohan's immediate sight, the men of the Riddermark believed Isengard no longer threatened them. Thus, the might of Rohan, battered but unbroken after Helm's Deep, was slow to react to rumors of Uruk-hai stragglers. Instead, they put their efforts toward rebuilding, burying their dead, and forging new alliances with Gondor. King Eomer, newly anointed, stood shoulder to shoulder with Aragorn, vowing that when the final call to arms sounded, Rohan would ride in force to the White City's aid. But none could foresee just how soon that call might come. An early taste of the combined Orc-Uruk presence befell the outskirts of Osgiliath. Under cover of darkness, a group of saboteurs slipped into the ruined city, crossing the Anduin in small rafts. The orcs among them had knowledge of old passages and sewer tunnels that led into the once great city's foundations. The Uruk-hai contributed their stamina and discipline, forging a lethal infiltration squad. The defenders of Osgiliath, uncertain in the gloom, found themselves assailed by an unexpected ferocity. A black alarm echoed through the battered stones, men shouting as fires sprang up. For a frantic hour, a fierce skirmish raged in the city's western quarter. In the end, the defenders held, but not without cost. Many men died, and an entire section of the causeway was put to the torch before the raiders vanished back into the night. Word of that assault sent ripples of concern through Minas Tirith. Gandalf himself arrived to counsel Denethor and the captains of the city, urging them to keep watch. Faramir, who had barely returned from Ithilien, insisted that the enemy's presence was swelling in the east, a gathering storm that would soon unleash its might on the very gates of Minas Tirith. Yet Denethor was too consumed by the weight of the Palantir, which he guarded in secret, wrestling with despair as it fed him fleeting images of doom. He allowed the defenses to be strengthened, but still harbored mistrust toward the wizard. In corners of the city, men whispered that the final test was near at hand. Others prayed that the Rohirrim would be swift to come to their aid. Meanwhile, deep within Mordor, the forging of a new device of war had begun. The orcs hammered out a fresh breed of siege machines, drawing from designs gleaned from Saruman's own cunning contraptions at Isengard. The battered remains of Grond, the great battering ram once used against the gates of Minas Tirith in a different timeline, had taught them the potential of monstrous siege engines. Now they worked in iron foundries day and night, shaping catapults of cruel efficiency, ballistae with greater range, and newly improved rams. The Uruk-hai lent their knowledge of explosives, crude black powders and blasting materials that Saruman had once refined for the assault on the Deeping Wall. Those secrets had not died with the fall of Isengard. Combined with the endless forges of Mordor, they promised an unprecedented level of destruction. Behind these efforts stood the Nazgûl, Sauron's most dreaded lieutenants, who occasionally rode into the smoky gloom to ensure the pace was kept. In the hush that followed their arrival, even the bickering orc captains and Uruk-hai taskmasters fell silent. The shrieks of the ringwraiths tore through the labyrinthine passages of the Dark Tower. Whips cracked more furiously whenever a Nazgûl was near. The entire host seemed whipped into a frenzy of productivity, fueled by the promise of soon descending upon Gondor with unstoppable might. Grashnak and Gorbog, now co-commanders over the combined infantry, oversaw the training of new recruits, both Orc and Uruk-hai. The white hand symbol had been struck from most of Saruman's old armor, replaced or covered by the Eye of Mordor. Some, however, still displayed the white hand, partially out of stubborn loyalty and partially to remember their roots. This caused friction with Sauron's loyal orcs, who saw it as an insult. Grashnak reminded them, with fang-bared threats, that all served a single purpose now, the destruction of Gondor. Many a duel broke out in the training pits, but the survivors grew stronger for it. Each death was replaced by more fresh recruits bred in the glooms and breeding pits. The monstrous legion's appetite for violence grew fiercer day by day. At last, there came a summons to Saruman himself. A bold orc messenger, eyes burning with fear but also with the dread authority of the Nazgûl, arrived at the gates of Isengard. The Ents, still watchful, stirred with suspicion but let him pass, for they sensed he was not so great a threat alone. He was escorted into the battered courtyard, the waters of the flooding still seeping around the pillars of stone. There he shouted up to the tower, "Saruman, the great Eye summons you. Will you remain caged, or will you join the final conquest? The hour of doom draws near." For a time, no answer came. Then, from a balcony high above, the ragged figure of Saruman emerged. His white robes were stained and tattered. His hair hung lank around his sharp face. Yet his voice, when he spoke, retained some of its old grandeur. "Tell your master," he said, "that Saruman has not abandoned his designs. I remain the chosen caretaker of the West. If he would invite me into his councils, I shall attend on my own terms. This land is not yet fully under his dominion." The orc sneered. "One does not speak to the great eye of terms. You will come, or your pitiful remnants will be ground underfoot. Choose wisely, white wizard." Saruman's face twisted. Perhaps once he had deluded himself that he was a partner, or even an equal to the Dark Lord. But now the threat was laid bare. He still possessed some knowledge of value to Sauron. He recognized, in that moment, that the Dark Lord's courtesy was fleeting. If he refused, Sauron might well send forth an army to crush Isengard entirely, or simply set the Nazgûl upon him. In his pride, Saruman believed that if he played this carefully, he could wrest advantage from the situation. Was he not once the head of the White Council, greater than Gandalf in lore? Did he not understand how to bend orcs to his will? Perhaps this alliance would be but a stepping stone toward reasserting his power, or perhaps he might manipulate Sauron from within. Such were the illusions Saruman fed himself. Thus, after a week's delay, during which the orc messenger waited with mounting impatience, Saruman descended from Orthanc. Accompanied by a small retinue of men and half-orcs who still served him, he exited the battered ring of Isengard, and the messenger led them east under the Ents' watchful gaze. The Ents stirred, moaning displeasure, but they did not hinder Saruman's departure. Treebeard, slow and wise, rumbled, "A dangerous road you walk, Saruman, but perhaps it will end as it must." The old Ent let them pass, for it was not the way of his kind to leave Fangorn and pursue the White Wizard into the east. Their duty was to guard their forest from further harm, and Saruman no longer possessed the means to lay waste to the wood. So the wizard's company vanished, traveling day and night until they neared the borders of Mordor. Along the way, Saruman witnessed with his own eyes the war camps teeming with Uruk-hai who had once marched under his banner, now wearing the eye. He said nothing, but those close to him noticed how his hands tightened into fists at the sight of them. He was forced to confront the reality that Sauron had taken from him what was once his prized creation. And yet he also sensed new possibilities. If he could only sway enough of the Uruks back to his side, who could say what might be done? Eventually, the White Wizard arrived at a fortress on the outskirts of Mordor's ashen plains. There, overshadowed by dark ramparts and the stench of sulfur vents, he was brought into the presence of one of the Nazgûl, a tall figure cloaked in black, face invisible behind a steel crown. Its hollow voice was a faint whisper of malice, yet even Saruman felt the chill of terror in its presence. Perhaps it was the Witch King or another, but it spoke with Sauron's authority. "Saruman," it said, "you come at last. The Master sees your mind. Your Uruk-hai are ours now. You shall serve, or you shall fall into endless night." Saruman bowed his head, though whether in genuine submission or a cunning pantomime, none could say. "I am weary of half measures. The time has come to strike at Gondor and see its strongholds crumble. What would you have me do?" The Nazgûl's robes shifted, and the shadows seemed to deepen. "Use your voice, Saruman. Bend your creatures to our will. Teach us the secrets of your black powders and your cunning devices. Serve without question. The Eye will reward you with a place of power in the new age." Saruman answered, "I shall," and thus the stage was set. Within days, new orders filtered down through the orc ranks, and the last scattered Uruk-hai were fully integrated into the armies of Mordor. Designs for war machines, gleaned from Saruman's knowledge, spread through the forges. In places, men loyal to Saruman worked side by side with the orcsmiths. Grashnak and Gorbog set to drilling the combined horde more relentlessly than ever. The Dark Lord's plan was to converge upon Gondor in a way more cunning than a mere frontal assault. Multiple columns of orcs would gather in the southern reaches near the Black Gate, while a specialized force, reinforced by Saruman's explosive contrivances, would attack from a flank. Meanwhile, if chance allowed, Saruman himself would orchestrate a final devastation, perhaps employing a vile new contraption that could shatter walls as easily as the explosive charges had once battered the Deeping Wall in Rohan. Sauron intended to strike fear into the hearts of men, to force them into a defensive stance, pinned between multiple armies. News of this growing threat reached Minas Tirith piecemeal. Scouts from Ithilien spied large columns on the move, but no one could confirm the scale of the host. Riders galloped across Anorion, bearing messages to Rohan, pleading for immediate aid. Though the men of the Mark had pledged their swords, they needed time to gather their ears. Eomer swiftly called for the muster of the riders, sounding the horns across the valleys. Yet war does not wait. Even as the Rohirrim prepared, the combined forces of Sauron's orcs and Saruman's Uruk-hai began their grand march. Over passes and barren plains they went, forging a path of destruction that caused the very earth to tremble under their iron-shod feet. They advanced with discipline seldom seen among orc-kind. Their siege engines groaned on colossal wheels. War drums pounded a relentless rhythm that echoed day and night, a black thunder heralding doom for Gondor. In Minas Tirith, the beacons were lit, summoning all allies. The White City's defenders took up posse. Tyans along the walls, eyes drawn to the horizon. Aragorn paced the ramparts, his heart heavy but resolute. Gandalf stood at his side, cloak flapping in the wind, staff gleaming as if capturing the waning sunlight. Somewhere in the tower above, Denethor brooded, lost in the fires of his own despair. Yet there was a spark of hope, for men still stood proud, and the knowledge that Rohan would ride to aid them offered strength. If the people of Gondor could hold out long enough, perhaps the tide of darkness could be turned. But this was no ordinary host. It was an unholy union born of two cunning masters. As the army approached, men upon the walls could see the banners bearing the eye, and here and there the ragged white hand. Siege towers loomed, taller than ever before, constructed with iron plating that shone black under the reddening sky. Huge catapults with reinforced frames rolled behind them. Strange cylindrical devices, rumored to hold black powder, were dragged in the train. The men recognized the cunning of Saruman in these new machines. On the second night of the siege, as the host encamped around Osgiliath, some of Saruman's specialists tested the black powder in a demonstration that lit the sky with a fiery roar. The watchers in Minas Tirith shuddered. Never before had orcs wielded such destructive force. The thick walls of the White City were strong, but if these contraptions were brought to bear, who could say how long they would hold? In the darkness, the final muster of Gondor's defenders arrived from the outlying fiefs. Dol Amroth's knights in their silver and blue, the men of Lossarnak in sturdy plate, the archers of Morthond Vale. Women and children took shelter in the deeper levels of the city, praying for deliverance. The clang of weapons and the thrum of hammering filled the air, as every able smith worked to produce arrows, spears, and swords. From the highest tower, a beacon fire blazed as a symbol of Gondor's cry for aid, visible for miles across the plains of Pelennor. And in distant Rohan, the horns answered, carrying the ancient promise. They would come. Yet no one knew how soon the final blow would fall. For among the orc ranks, impatience festered. The presence of the Uruk-hai lent a new sense of urgency, for these creatures had once battered down the gates of Helm's Deep in a single night. They had been beaten then by a hair's breadth of fortune, but now they marched in greater numbers under Sauron's command. All the petty disputes and power struggles were overshadowed by the chilling might of the Nazgûl. With whips and shrill cries, the ringwraiths compelled the army forward. The lines advanced under the cover of darkness, crossing the Anduin in force. They threw their weight at the ruined city of Osgiliath, forcing the defenders to retreat to the western bank. Faramir's men fought valiantly to buy time, harrying the invaders with arrow fire from every nook and cranny. But the overwhelming force drove them back. The combined Orc-Uruk ranks were too numerous and too disciplined. They advanced with locked shields, bristling spears, and unstoppable momentum. Faramir was forced to give the order to fall back to Minas Tirith, lest his men be annihilated. As the defenders retreated, a black cheer rose among the invaders, echoing across the waters. And so the siege of Gondor began in earnest. As dawn broke, the armies of darkness surged forth, arraying themselves before the great walls of the White City. Catapults were hauled into position, ladders stacked, and monstrous siege towers rumbled toward the vulnerable points. Saruman's black powder barrels were ready to blow open any gate or section of wall that might prove stubborn. The men of Gondor braced themselves upon the ramparts, and from behind the parapets, they gazed upon the sea of hateful eyes beneath the banners of the Eye and the White Hand. This was merely the start of what promised to be a bitter, epic confrontation. Gondor, heart of men's resistance, was locked in a death struggle with an enemy that had never before been so well coordinated or so heavily armed. Yet, in the midst of fear, a hope remained that perhaps Rohan would ride in time, or that some other stroke of fortune might break the darkness. Unseen by most, Gandalf worked behind the scenes, sending out urgent messages in secret, and preparing for a last stand that would test the endurance of all free folk. Whether Gondor would stand or fall might well depend on how quickly allies could arrive, or if the cunning of Saruman and the might of Sauron could be turned back by the resilience of men and the wizard who still stood against them.